Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about a topic that has the country on edge, the widespread protests and calls for violence that have erupted across the United States following November 5th. Right now there's a lot going on out there and tensions are high. It's a time where we all need to understand what's really happening and, more importantly, how to protect ourselves and our families in the midst of this chaos. If you haven't yet, be sure to hit the like button if you find value in this content. Subscribe to stay informed, and join the conversation in the comments below. This is about preparing for anything and everything, and there's no time like now to be ready. So, here's where we are. With Donald Trump, now the president-elect, a wave of intense reactions has surged across the country. Major cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, and New York City are seeing people take to the streets. And while protests have always been a part of American democracy, what we're seeing now is a whole new level of frustration and defiance. And it's not just limited to marches and chants. People are venting deep-rooted anger over a range of issues that have been building for years. This isn't just about the Republicans taking control anymore. It's about broad ideological divides that are now spilling over into our cities and towns, stirring up fears about safety, stability, and even the nation's future. For some, these protests are an outlet, but for many others, it's a sign of escalating dangers and new risks that none of us can afford to ignore. We're talking about an environment that feels volatile, where simple marches can shift to confrontations, and ordinary city blocks can become battlegrounds in the span of minutes. And if that's not unsettling enough, we have online threats fueling the fire, a steady stream of posts calling for direct action against anyone seen as supporting the other side. Whether that's law enforcement, public officials, or private citizens who are simply exercising their right to voice support for Trump. Right now, it's a climate that's increasingly hostile and unpredictable, and we're seeing the impact in ways that touch almost every corner of society. And we're only at the beginning of what could unfold. I can't stress this enough. Do not get involved in these protests. If you're thinking of observing or joining in, just don't. The situation is far too unpredictable, and the risks are simply not worth it. If you want to stay informed, do so from a safe distance. Watch the unbiased news, follow trusted updates, but stay home and stay safe, because things can go from peaceful to dangerous in an instant. The nature of these protests is different, and it's not just about the number of people out on the streets. It's about the intent, the coordination, and the anger that's behind these movements. These aren't just spontaneous gatherings. They're carefully organized, planned events where people are going in with specific goals in mind, some of which include defiance against what they perceive as an overreach of power or a threat to their rights. And we're seeing tactics that are meant to provoke. In New York City, for example, there were reports of symbolic defacement, acts that aren't just aimed at making a point, but are meant to send a message of outright rejection of the current administration. You combine this with property damage in places like Seattle and arrests tied to violent clashes, and you get a picture that's not only intense, but also increasingly confrontational. And here's the thing. There's a direct risk of escalation. Police in these cities are stepping up their presence. Some cities are even considering National Guard support. And we're hearing talk about federal resources on standby, ready to deploy if things really get out of hand. But here's the thing. The sight of increased law enforcement and military presence could be seen as a challenge to those who are determined to resist. It could push protesters into more extreme actions, creating even bigger standoffs. In some cases, we're already seeing law enforcement report resistance, with officers facing hostility. And that's creating a cycle where each side is digging in deeper, ready for a fight. Now, with the added dimension of online threats, some very real, specific, and dangerous, we're seeing rhetoric that isn't just about organizing protests, but actively calling for targeted attacks. This is a very different type of threat. We're talking about threats against public officials, against institutions, and even against regular citizens. With these calls for action out there on social media, we're stepping into an era where isolated incidents could suddenly blow up into larger, more widespread chaos. And when people see their own neighborhoods or workplaces threatened by calls for violence, that fear is very real. Now, as we look at where all of this could be headed, the future doesn't look calm or stable. We have to consider that these protests and the issues fueling them are not likely to just disappear. If anything, we're seeing signs that they could evolve into something even more intense and long-lasting, affecting not just big cities, but potentially reaching suburban and rural areas in ways we haven't seen before. First, let's talk about the real possibility of sustained civil unrest. If this trend continues, it could lead to prolonged demonstrations and even occupations of public spaces. Imagine areas where protesters take over parks, streets, or public buildings, holding their ground in defiance of the government. This is something we've seen in other parts of the world, but it's a scenario that could very well play out here if tensions don't ease. And with that kind of unrest, we're likely to see disruptions that affect local economies, stores closing, jobs lost, and a breakdown of basic city functions. These kinds of impacts could trickle down to affect everything from emergency response times to public services, making life harder for everyone in those cities, whether they're part of the protests or not. We also have to consider the risk of cyber attacks, a threat that's been looming over us for years, but one that could now be more relevant than ever. Imagine the disruption if critical infrastructure like power grids, emergency services, or even financial institutions were targeted. We're talking about potential blackouts, interruptions to medical and emergency services, and even difficulties in accessing your own bank accounts or digital payments. The fact that foreign entities may look at this unrest as an opportunity to exploit weaknesses in our systems makes this scenario all the more likely and all the more dangerous. If attacks like these coincide with ongoing protests, we'd be facing not only physical threats, but also logistical and economic disruptions on a massive scale. And let's not ignore the very real risk of terrorism and extremist activity. Large gatherings, whether they're protests or counter-protests, are potential targets, and the consequences of a single violent act could be far-reaching, sparking even more outrage and prompting calls for revenge or justice. It's a cycle that could create a lasting impact on our communities, driving people apart and building even deeper divides. Beyond these risks, there's also the looming threat of resource shortages. If businesses continue to close due to unrest, or if supply chains break down, we could start seeing real scarcities in essential goods, food, fuel, even medications. Suburban and rural communities might initially feel less of this impact, but as resources become strained, everyone will feel the pinch. Imagine going to the store only to find shelves empty, gas stations with limited fuel, or pharmacies out of basic medicines. This type of shortage would place immense stress on families and communities, making preparedness a top priority for everyone. Finally, there's the possibility of a major population shift. As cities become less safe, we could see an urban exodus where people flee to suburban or rural areas in search of safety and stability. This kind of demographic shift could reshape entire communities, putting strain on housing, resources, and local infrastructure. Suburban and rural areas could see population booms, and with that, an increase in demand for schools, healthcare facilities, and basic services, potentially altering the social and economic landscape for years to come. Now, let's get into the part that's within your control, the steps you can take to protect yourself and your family. No matter where you live, there are ways to be prepared for whatever may come. Whether you're in a city, a suburb, or a rural area, there are steps you can take to fortify your safety, secure your resources, and stay informed. For those of you in rural areas, the focus should be on resilience and self-sufficiency. Start by stocking up on essentials, enough food, fuel, and medicine to last for weeks, because supply lines may get disrupted and stores could run out of basic goods. Form a community watch group with your neighbors. Knowing that you're not alone is a huge advantage, especially in isolated areas. And yes, consider being prepared to defend your property. If you live far from emergency services, you might be your own first line of defense, so make sure you're trained and ready if the need arises. In suburban areas, you're going to want to focus on coordination and security. Make sure you're connected with your neighborhood and stay in touch, especially with neighbors you can trust. Establish a neighborhood watch or strengthen one if it already exists, so you're all on the same page about what to do if things get dicey. Now is the time to reinforce your home's defenses. Think about motion sensor lights, secure locks, and even cameras if possible. And be prepared for possible transportation issues. If unrest spills over, you may need alternative routes for commuting or emergency travel. Having backup transportation options ready, such as knowing alternative roads or planning a place to stay if things heat up nearby, could save you a lot of trouble. And keep a stock of essential supplies, enough to last for several weeks, so you're not relying on stores that may be unsafe or understocked. Now, For those of you in urban areas, your situation is unique, and you face some of the highest risks right now. First and foremost, stay informed and be aware of protest hotspots. If you know where the demonstrations are likely to occur, avoid those areas entirely, even if it means taking a longer route or staying put. If possible, consider moving out of high-risk zones temporarily, maybe staying with friends or family outside the city during peak protest times. It's a hard decision, but sometimes taking a proactive approach can keep you safer in the long run. Another essential step for city dwellers is to prepare an emergency go bag. This should include basics like first aid, water, cash, a flashlight, and any medications you or your family may need. Keep it by the door so you can grab it and go if things escalate quickly. And make sure your home is as secure as possible. Reinforce your doors and windows. Install deadbolts, use security bars if necessary, and consider safety films that make windows harder to break. If you live in an apartment, talk to building management about security protocols or possible lockdown procedures to ensure everyone is on the same page. Urban residents also need to think about the potential for power and utility disruptions. With increased risk of infrastructure being targeted, you should be prepared for outages. Consider a small portable generator, a stash of batteries, and enough bottled water to cover at least a week, especially if you're in a high-rise where water access might depend on electric pumps. And coordinate with neighbors. Having a support network, even if it's just for sharing updates or offering help in an emergency, can make a huge difference. No matter where you're located, there are some universal steps everyone should be taking right now to increase their readiness and resilience. These aren't just for the worst-case scenario. They're practical steps that can help anyone navigate uncertain times with a bit more peace of mind. First, establish a family communication plan. Make sure each person in your household knows how to get in touch, especially if regular cell service goes down or networks are overloaded. Designate a central meeting place if you're separated and can't reach each other, and consider alternative ways of staying connected, like two-way radios or an encrypted messaging app for emergencies. It's also wise to keep a supply of cash on hand. With the risk of digital banking being disrupted, having cash can be invaluable for basic purchases. ATMs could be unreliable, so a small reserve in your home is a good safeguard. And make sure you have a well-stocked supply of essentials like food, water, hygiene products, and any critical medications. Think of it as preparing for a short-term emergency where trips to the store aren't an option. Stay informed, but do so from reliable sources. Download local news apps, sign up for government alerts, or check in with trusted networks to get verified information. Don't rely on unverified sources or speculation that could add to the stress. Mental preparedness is also crucial during these challenging times. Prolonged periods of unrest can take a toll on your mental health, so don't neglect practices that keep you grounded, whether that's exercise, meditation, or spending quality time with family. Create a daily routine that gives you structure and helps manage stress and limit exposure to distressing news when possible. Sometimes, less is more. If you're concerned about drawing unwanted attention, maintain a neutral public profile. Avoid displaying any political symbols, bumper stickers, or signs that could be perceived as provocative. This goes for social media as well. Keep a low profile online, especially if you're in a high-risk area, and avoid making any posts that could invite controversy or retaliation. Now is not the time to invite trouble. Finally, make sure you have an emergency transportation kit in your car. This should include water, non-perishable snacks, a first aid kit, a blanket, and a basic toolkit in case of a breakdown. Keeping your gas tank at least half full at all times can ensure you're ready to leave at a moment's notice if the situation worsens or if you need to evacuate quickly. In times like these, the importance of being prepared can't be overstated. The current situation after November 5th is tense, volatile, and unpredictable, with potential long-term impacts on all of us, regardless of where we live. By taking the steps we've discussed today, you can protect yourself, your family, and your community, helping to maintain a sense of stability and security, even as the world around us feels increasingly chaotic. So remember, preparation isn't about fear. It's about responsibility. It's about having a plan, staying informed, and being ready to adapt to whatever comes our way. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more insights on how to navigate these turbulent times, and share this video with anyone who could benefit from a little extra guidance right now. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, when you're prepared, you're powerful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.